Record. There we go. All right. Oh, good evening. Before we start the formalities, I'm formally acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. My name is Brenda Masters. I am coming from Canberra, and we proudly occupy land which has never been ceded by the Ngambri or Ngunnawal people. And people around Australia will have the opportunity to view this interview, and we're acknowledging the traditional owners of all of those lands. Pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome our special guest today, Associate Professor Louise Stone, who, as coincidence would have it, is also on the same land as me. And I'm going to hand over to Louise to introduce herself to you all, and I hope that we have a really fabulous time talking to Louise about her latest project.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Louise Stone. I've actually worked in a few states in Australia and I've been in Canberra since 2014. Um, I guess I was talking tonight about a large project I've done on sexual harassment in medicine, and it's now been a decade. So it started in 2014 when I was still in Sydney, and what happened then was I saw an intern who had been assaulted by her boss. And I've done complex mental health my entire career. I started doing the stupid thing of doing psychology at night while I was doing medicine. So, it wasn't new to me to see people, obviously, who were survivors of sexual harassment. But this consultation was very, very different. Lots of silence, unbelievable amounts of shame. And afterwards, I was reflecting on it, went looking for literature, and there really wasn't anything except, as usual, there are always people who will make simple solutions to complicated problems. So there were plenty of compulsory modules to try and get people thinking, but that was about it at the time. And I guess as a GP, I guess one of the things that we often end up doing is contextual research. We find something in our practice that isn't right, or we don't understand, and we try and find out. We find there's no research, and so we end up doing it ourselves. And that's what happened with me. I guess I had a background as a qualitative researcher, and I'd already done my PhD on medically unexplained symptoms. So it wasn't that I wasn't used to weird and slightly, I suppose, unstructured things. So I went and interviewed doctors over a period of time who'd been survivors of abuse, and in the middle of that was when the Gabrielle McMullen case happened, where she stood up and talked about Caroline Tan, and suddenly we had the surgeons talking about operating with respect. So I guess it all sprung from there, my interest. Weirdly enough, I often get asked whether this has been my experience, and the answer is no. I actually haven't. I mean, I've had experiences of sexual harassment. I don't think you can be female without it, but certainly not by a superior in medicine, and certainly not with that sort of power differential that has characterized a lot of the trauma that I've seen and the trauma that people have endured. So, no, that wasn't my experience, but I do take on board the military phrase, with the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And so it ended up being me. I didn't know what I was doing, but we're GPs. We look it up, we make it up, we make it work. And I guess that happened. And then Marjorie, I can see is online. Marjorie and I went to the International Medical Women's Association conference in New York. And I was really struck by the fact that there are all these American women standing up and saying, oh, as women of color, this is what we think. But the African and Asian women weren't speaking. And it seemed wrong to me. So I decided to write a book, which I didn't know how to do either. Collected all the authors, got it all together, started writing about sexual harassment, and then we had COVID, and they all disappeared to run intensive cares in Italy and, obstetrics in Pakistan. So we had to then gather them all together again, and thank goodness the book is now finally at Cambridge University Press. So I'm hoping that, against hope, what I want Santa to bring me for Christmas is no edits, but that won't be quite that good. But I hope that there are minimal edits and they
The
send it back to
advanced
me
copy
saying,
in your
yeah,
inbox would be an
yes,
excellent thing. Yeah.
yes. Absolutely. I hope they just say, oh, it's all excellent. There's only a few punctuation marks or something. I'm sure it's going to be more than that, but we're hoping to have it published in 2025, which will be great.
Well, that's all wonderful. What do you see as one of the key learnings that you've come, where's this book going with for you or
Yeah,
for
it's
us?
interesting. It's been really a very interesting journey. I was very lucky to have a young editor. I recruited a young editor very early on, and I'm very grateful. She's quite an expert on gender studies, and she was the one who just hunted through social media because all of these groups are hidden. So it's very difficult to find people to speak. And I learned a lot about countries I really didn't expect. So we weren't able to get a representative from Scandinavia. We tried for about 5 years, and that surprised me. I thought Scandinavia would be, a set of countries that would contribute to this. They all thought it was terribly important. In fact, I even found people doing research in the area, but no one was prepared to write. And I thought, wow, okay, that's interesting. Egypt was interesting, where I talked to a colleague in Egypt, and she said, I can't think of a case. Now, people say that all the time, and she said, no, 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 you don't understand. I actually work in gender-based violence, and I actually can't think of a case. And we realized after she said, I'll go away and talk to people. But in Egypt, the majority of doctors are women. And if you want to be a powerful bloke, you do business, you don't do medicine. And so the power differentials that we would see in some of our countries where medicine is exactly the profession you go into if you are starting, as a predator, then, it doesn't happen in Egypt.
That's
Japan, here's one for Japan. Oh my Lord. So 2018, they discovered that Japan was giving women a 5% handicap on their entrance exams because they because they had an unfair advantage because of their communication skills.
Oh my goodness. So, do you know what the gender balance is for doctors in Japan?
Yes, I do. And actually, the interesting thing is the average age of retirement for surgeons in Japan is 30.
Our guys aren't even qualified by then.
And one of the reasons is that the Japanese women who are on our project told us that it's quite rare to keep your operating rights if you come back off maternity leave. I
Oh,
know.
so the majority of they're women who've gotten but then they've decided biology rules.
Mhm.
They have a baby and they can't get back into their chosen profession.
Yep. Well, they can, but they just can't operate. Argentina.
Yeah, yeah, go on.
Oh, Argentina. See, it's been fascinating. I didn't know any of this.
Yeah.
So Argentina, it was astonishing to me. So Argentina in its legislation has a clause that says everybody has the right to go to university. So they don't have selection into medicine, or they certainly haven't in the past. Everybody who wants to do medicine gets in. And then they have like a Game of Thrones 7 years where they don't see patients until fairly late. This is a few years ago, so it may have changed, but they don't see patients till late, but they have the sudden death exams. So they lose thousands every 6 months who fail.
So you're saying that they're admitting maybe what 10 times as many people
That's
as
right.
can be accommodated, right?
That's exactly right. And then, of course, it's the people who have privilege who don't have to work who actually get better marks. So you end up with the same result, even though it seems more equitable. And then you have this awful situation. I mean, I thought we were bad, but 7 years in, they then do their final exam and they write their names up on the board in order of achievement, and then they write up all the positions and they say, right, Dr. Jones, your position one, which job do you want? And he says, oh, I'll take pediatrics in wherever. And they cross that one off and move to the next person. When they run out of positions, everyone else goes home and fails. So here was I thinking, gosh, that's great in Argentina. You can go and you can do your
Study
degree if you want.
medicine.
Yeah, I know. And the interesting thing with the Argentinian doctor that I spoke to was she said, you know what's really strange is that when I was in Argentina, I can't actually remember being alone. I don't think I was really alone until I came to Australia. And I
Meaning,
thought to
sorry,
myself,
alone as in work or?
socially, yep, she says, well, me and my colleagues, we travel in packs. We never just hang around individually. It doesn't happen. And so when she was placed rural as a doctor, she wouldn't have had all those strategies and so on that we have, because we're much more solitary, individualistic sort of culture. That was very strange for her. And as it was, it would have made her more vulnerable because she wouldn't have had the same strategies, I suppose, that, our children might have traveling in ones or twos.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that
Yeah.
either.
So this system in Argentina, which you say started off as equitable and ended up just being pretty much a version of,
Mm,
privilege hanging
mm.
out, taking it out. Does that end up with the same sort of power differentials that we see here? So that it's the really powerful, rich men who end up in the positions that put them in the position of being able to be sexual predators. Do you and is that something that's been reported?
Yes. It's interesting. So one of the editors on the book is a woman called Rosalind Searle. She's amazing. And that's where I've been in the last month over in Glasgow. And she did some work on trust. And really there seems to be two groups. There seems to be predators who choose medicine because it allows them to predate, I suppose, if that's a word. Um, and if you have that sort of personality style, that sort of domineering sort of way of being, then you'll pick medicine, politics, law, because it gives you a position of power. And then there's this other group who are the group that we probably need to think about a little more, who slide into sexual harassment and often um, seem to have some sort of vulnerability, like they're divorced or they're lonely and they misunderstand or misattribute, and they seem to be remediable.
Mhm.
Um, in general, people who sexually harass don't change. It's very unusual in the regulatory bodies not to see people reoffend and reoffend and reoffend. But there is this group, and the more I've thought about it, I've always thought this, I often think, I have a daughter who had major surgery when she was tiny, and I still remember her surgeon coming in at 11 o'clock, getting everything organised, and then starting theatre, 13 hours in theatre, and then being back the following morning. And he was the only one in the state doing this sort of surgery. And he had, obviously loved his wife and kids who were in a lovely photo, and he's a beautiful man. But if he wasn't, his job, he had 7 days a week, 24 hours a day on call for year after year after year. And every single family was saying, oh, thank you so much, you've saved my child's life. Um, he's having to face them with the child dying. And I think if you had any vulnerabilities psychosocially, what do you then become after 30 years of that? And I
30
certainly have.
years of adulation and
That's
being
right.
told you're the best person in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've met, country obstetricians who have a terribly hard time being on constant call and often, dragged in at the last hour with very, very stressful. I did rural obstetrics, and I've always been so grateful to those rural obstetricians, but gee, I could never do their job.
Mm.
It's hard, and they don't get the balancing side. They miss their kids' things, they miss their families, they don't have the same, and we do that. We create that as a
So
culture
you're
as well.
saying that, yeah, the culture of medicine
Mm.
feeds that sort of dependency and then going back into, the medical sphere to fulfill every need that we have.
Yeah. And I wonder, it's the culture of management too, though, isn't it? Because what we've got at the moment is, in my view anyway, is we've sort of got dare I say it, a sort of an abusive relationship between the clinicians and the management, in that the management is demanding um, things that the clinicians can't provide. They know how to provide it, but they haven't got the resources to do so. And then we've got the moral injury that the clinicians carry because they're not performing the way they know they can perform because the resources aren't there to perform well. And then just to add to that, we then have, a much more assertive APRA breathing down an individual, but not a corporate's neck. So, in my view, often the reason that, this man was the only surgeon wasn't a choice. It wasn't his choice.
Hmm.
It was a choice to only employ one person. And that's all very well, but the cost is borne by the profession and their patients, not by the managerial side of things, and that worries me. To me, there's been a lot more personalizing of systemic problems recently, and I think this is another one of them, really.
Yeah, gosh. So, there's so many learnings there. I'd like to just
Mm.
hark back to what you said about Scandinavia. Do you have any insights into what's going on there?
No, it was one of those mysteries I really struggled to try and work out. In fact, I even had an academic come over and talk about her work with perpetrators, and I still couldn't get through to Scandinavia. But we did have some countries that, Africa, for instance. We have a couple of countries in Africa, Zambia, Nigeria. And I think it's really interesting listening to their stories. So the book itself, it's in four parts, and the first part we describe basic principles, gender in medicine and all that sort of stuff, and the historical nature of abuse and so on. And the second part, we got experts from around the world to look from their disciplinary perspective. So we got leaders in law and human rights and medical education, therapy, all to talk about why is this such a wicked problem? Why is it so hard to fix? And then the largest bit, we have countries where people have written about their country and their context and then given us a case and then a discussion. And the one that really struck me was Malaysia, because Malaysia, in the previous government, what happened was there was an orthopedic surgeon, and one of the authors from our book told us that um, there was a young doctor who reported to the Minister for Health that this orthopedic surgeon had sexually harassed her. And the minister, then wrote to every single female doctor in Malaysia and asked them all if they'd had a problem. And when they wrote back to him, he took away this guy's registration and his visa and threw him out of the country.
Really?
Well, that worked, which can
So clearly the feedback was it wasn't the first time and it was a
yeah,
an
that's
issue.
right. That's right. But
Wow.
you don't necessarily, I wasn't sure in, a predominantly conservative country how that would go.
Yeah.
And
And the
what
Minister
happened?
for Health was male.
Yeah,
Mm.
he just said not on my watch and basically did what the military did here.
Yeah,
Just
that's
decided enough was
impressive.
enough.
I
Yeah.
must admit, I didn't know where your story was going, obviously, and I thought, oh, this is
Mm,
going to end badly. She will have been told that she shouldn't have complained because nobody else had a problem. But in fact, wow,
mm. And
yeah.
if you contrast that with the UK, now this is the scary one, and this is what I'm working on at the moment. So I'm trying to, in traveling to the UK recently, I was catching up with a lot of people. And one of the things that's really bothering me is the crossover between law and regulation. So obviously, sexual harassment is illegal. However, it often doesn't get dealt with in law. It gets dealt with in universities and regulatory bodies and medical defence, and they all tend to pass it around like a hot potato. But here's the situation. So there was a young Asian woman, and I've said that deliberately because we know that intersectional disprivilege uh, increases risk. So she was quite severely harassed by a senior surgeon, and she reported to the GMC, which is the equivalent of our board. It's slightly different, basically that. And about halfway through, she had been grilled and cross-examined by the barristers who were working for the perpetrator. And it just became too much for her. And so she said that she wished to withdraw her complaint. And the medical council wrote to her and said, "You are under mandatory reporting obligations, so you cannot withdraw your complaint because that would be considered unprofessional conduct. But if you are impaired, you can withdraw your complaint, but you'll need to stop practicing."
What an impasse. That's
Yes. And I can't see how we're any different. We haven't had a case like that, but would we be different? Probably not. We've got the same regulation. We've got
We've
the
got
same.
very clever lawyers who are happy to argue
Yes,
anything to get their client
that's
off the
right. So we're looking at that with Scotland, because Scottish law and English, I know nothing about law, but Scottish law and English law are apparently quite different.
hook.
And we are more, I can't remember which way we go, but I've got a barrister in the three countries and who are working on this, and then three of us who've been working on the book from different perspectives, including the surgeon who was involved in this case, to try and look at, well, when does regulation become law? Like, why are we cross-examining in a medical board? Where does that happen?
Mm,
How does that work? And where's the line? Like, this was absolutely in the field of law, like it was severe, and yet it was managed by the board. And I'm thinking, where do
okay,
we, where's it fit?
so you're saying we haven't had a case like that in Australia, but I'm sure we've had reports.
Oh
So,
yes, well, actually, it depends who you speak to. So, um, I've spoken, I've spoken to quite a few people with the medical board here, and I'm sure we've had cases. We certainly, there's been reports, um, certainly of things like domestic violence, where there's two doctors and one of them is abusing the other. We've had plenty of that sort of thing. And obviously, there's been, unfortunately, so many reports of doctor on patient violence.
mm,
But we have had reports, yes, but we haven't had that circumstance yet. But all the building blocks are there.
mm,
We've got the same mandatory reporting obligations. We've got the same requirements. So that bothers me. It's another one of those things where I feel individual. We move a systemic problem onto an individual, and it becomes theirs to wear, and that's just wrong. The other thing is, of course, what we know from the training survey is that of all the people who've experienced bullying, harassment, and racism, and we can't divide them up from the training survey in Australia, 50% it's from doctors. There's a crossover, so there's more than 100% in total. 50% from doctors, 33% from nurses, and I think it's now 40% from patients and families. So we are
this is
changing
across
shape.
all disciplines of trainees.
Yep,
It's, yeah, okay.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. So, we've got to sort of ask the question of how this fits. And of course, the board isn't set up that way because there's a nursing board and there's a medical board. And so, and the two don't necessarily seem to mesh in any way. So I'm not sure how regulation is going to work. Or
Mm,
law. I mean, we now have the compulsory requirement that you have to ensure that you achieve sexual safety in your workplace, but that's never been tested. So I don't know how that's going to work in practice. It's been illegal for how many decades, and it hasn't seemed to have made much of a difference. So I'm
true.
not sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I'm sure we're all coming from a position of prevention and changing the regulation, changing the culture and environment so that it becomes less of an issue. But how do you see that the best way for someone, and I'm not just saying a woman, who's being sexually harassed in medicine, because I'm sure
Yep.
that there are some
Yep.
predatory females
All genders.
as
Yep.
well, it happens across all genders. But how do you see is the best way forward for someone right now in Australia?
Yeah, it's tricky. I'm just going to share my screen and show you. a slide that might give us a little bit of an answer. I'm sorry to walk through this a little bit quickly, but let me just show you the problem. There's several ways you can go about doing this, and several organisations where you can start. And I think it really makes a difference what you're trying to achieve. So when I've done this work, there you go. When I've done this work before, we think that survivors have one of three, or a combination of three motives. They seem to want justice, or healing, or safety, you know. And so some of them will say, so for instance, the survivor in the John Kearsley case, which is the only successful prosecution we've had in the criminal court in Australia, her motivation was that she was invited, for those who don't know, John Kearsley was a professor of radiation oncology. She was his registrar. He invited her over for dinner, and she thought she was going to a family dinner. He drugged her. He put benzos in her wine. And her motivation was that she could have hit a child driving home. So she doesn't remember driving home. Uh, and she also still had benzos in her wine 3 days later, and she was back at work and she didn't know. So safety was a major concern for her. She felt obliged ethically to report. But some will say, well, it's healing, and others will say it's justice. We need to, punish this person and get them out of the profession because they are dangerous and they're dangerous for others. So I think it depends a little bit on where people start. But as you can see, if you go across that bottom there, there are a number of doors. And actually, when we held the summit last year, one of the things we tried to do was to get experts in each of these areas to try and explain what's behind a door, because that's the hardest thing. You don't know. Once you open that door, you often start a cascade of things that you're not really prepared for. And my personal opinion is we should have somebody who is proficient, that could be a person in the center of a discussion that doesn't necessarily start. So I think you need to talk to someone first before you make your decision, rather than disclose immediately. Find somebody who understands this stuff. Talk about something about a friend, and if they don't feel safe, don't do it. There are people all over the place in the medical defence organisations and the doctors' health services in particular. Um, and I think that if you start with thinking about what your options are before you disclose, you're more likely to make a good decision, and to stand back a little bit and say, well, what will happen if I do report? What will that do? Because once that door's open, it's very hard to shut again. And sometimes opening one door locks another. So, for instance, reporting to universities and hospitals and so on, it makes it slightly harder then to go through law. So the lawyers will tell you that it's good, if you're going to report this as illegal, it's best to do that up front. So it's quite a difficult space. And
So
I think
meaning that if you're reporting to a medical board or
yeah,
industrial relations sort, you'll
yeah,
mess with the evidence and the case so much that the legal thing just can't proceed.
that's
Okay.
exactly right. And what some people experience, those of us in general practice will know about the collusion of anonymity. This is Bailint, who said that, the patient, he gets passed from specialist to specialist to specialist, and no one ever takes ownership until they're exhausted and leave. That's sometimes the experience here, that people will go from one to the other. It's even simple things like, if you're a student, for instance, do you report to your university or your hospital? If you're placed in Darwin and you're an ANU student, who do you report to? And the hospital will have a very strong opinion that it's a hospital, and the university will have a very strong opinion it's a university. For the student, it's a little harder. And I actually think this is where GPs have a real role. They won't know, but they'll find out.
Oh.
And I think you need to think before you jump, because it can be very, very tricky for people, and they should be able to make their own choice. They should know what's behind the doors before they have to open them. I really feel strongly about that.
Do you think
Mm.
it's important that a person understands their own motivation as part of that process of deciding which avenue to take and which door to open.
Yes, and I also think, one of the things that I've realized doing this work is that a lot of people think policies fix things, which of course we know they don't. Policies can be just as performative as anything else. You can have a nice, shiny policy, but the way we do things around here is not necessarily the policy that's written down. And from my point of view, one of the things that's the hardest to get past is the subconscious stuff. So to give you an example, I interviewed this lovely woman who was now in her 30s and, she's qualified and she's got children and a family. And she was relating an experience when she was in her rural term as an intern where she was assaulted by a registrar who was drunk coming back from the team dinner. And she apologized all the way through, just apologized all the way through. That wasn't really that
Apologise to
serious.
you for telling you about
Yeah,
you.
yeah, it wasn't that serious. It really was fine.
Yeah.
And at the end, I said to her, if this happened to your daughter, what would you say? And she said, oh, it's illegal. Shouldn't happen. And I went, what about you? And I swear she looked me straight in the eye and she said, maybe I should have been more professional and not smiled as much.
Ah.
Now that stayed with me because I think we have to get past the unconscious burying of this stuff. We
Mm.
doctors are taught to bury stuff. It's a survival trait, isn't it? We can't treat a burned child unless we put the trauma somewhere so that we can get on with it.
Mm.
And it's natural that we spring to that. I mean, survivors of all types do that anyway, but we've got it double in that we've learned to do that as well. We slam down the lid and then we get on with it.
Yeah.
And
But she was actually actively blaming herself for
yes,
a part of the problem.
yes. But so does the board. Let's think about the medical board now. It talks about, what I say is weaponizing resilience. You should be resilient. You're not resilient enough. The medical board now has in our code of conduct, we're responsible for our own well-being and we're responsible for managing not overworking.
Mm.
How does a junior doctor do that?
Oh, exactly. Totally out of their control, and they're
Yeah. So,
castigated if they clock off at the right time or,
yes.
without having finished every task they've been given. Yeah.
That's right. So I think that this is another collusion of anonymity problem of I think there is a weaponizing of well-being that goes on that says that the individual's responsible for it and therefore it's not a systemic problem. The individual should just, be resilient and do some more yoga and have another green smoothie. I think there's a lot of that going on. And this is a complex problem. And the most complex part of it, I think, is realizing what happened to you and even getting to, past enough, just moving past silence. One of our authors has done a PhD looking at how to get junior doctors to speak
Mm.
because they don't. They are silenced. They won't speak of their own experience very readily. And they certainly don't in this space. They bury it. So for me, it's not just about what happens when when they actually do report and they have to make a choice to report. It's getting them to the point where they can make a decision about what it is that they want. And sometimes you've got to just sit with healing, you
Mm.
know, and they shouldn't have to. I'm big and ugly enough. I don't care anymore. One of the great things about being a GP is that hospital don't employ me. So, I don't lose anything by calling out bad behavior, but an intern does. And
Yeah.
they
But
shouldn't have to
also
be
the
doing
shame
work.
that's associated
Yeah,
with
completely.
having your name,
Yeah.
out there.
Yeah. And when they get to my ancient age, I'm sure they'll be calling it out too, but they shouldn't have to do it as interns.
Mm.
They shouldn't have to carry this load on their own. And I think that's where GPs are actually really good because we know the hospital, but we're not in the hospital. So they don't see it as a threat to talk to people like us because
It
we
is
can't,
sequestered to the side. It's not
yeah,
automatic.
we don't wreck their career. We don't take records. Let's see,
Exactly.
Marjorie's got a hand up.
Marjorie has her hand up, the other GP in the room.
I just want to be careful about it being we're not in the hospital system, because we have the largest number of trainees in the whole
Yes.
country. So doctors in training are more often in general practices, and private general practices, particularly in rural general practice, are at very, very high risk.
Yes, you're right, Marjorie. I should have said that. Thank you very much for pointing them out. You are right. And it bothers me with our international medical graduates about that. So, for instance, one of the things I found out about Indonesia is that in places in Indonesia, when you train, your supervisor is your patron, and you could be responsible for cooking the dinner, picking the children up after school, polishing the car, a whole lot of servile behaviors towards your supervisor. And it made me think that, when I was the senior advisor for GP training, it would be natural if we were sending say, an Indonesian registrar, we would think, oh, it'd be great to send them to a practice with other Indonesian doctors. Is it? What assumptions are made? I'd never thought of that. Would it mean then if I sent them to a small town in a practice with, several Indonesian bosses, does that then put them in a more vulnerable position? I guess I don't know, but I'd never thought of it. But
Interesting.
international medical graduates are very vulnerable.
So has your research shown that IMGs are more likely to be, you say they're very vulnerable and we can't argue against that, but are there more reports, or where it's only when we go mining that we find that things have happened?
So in the UK, the answer is yes. In Australia, um, our training survey, and we know that the most vulnerable doctors, going a little back to Marjorie's point, that the greatest time of vulnerability is intern first year resident. And as they get more senior, the vulnerability drops off. It doesn't go to zero, but it drops off a little bit. So they are most vulnerable in their first few years. Um, and we know that overseas, and certainly in the UK, the international medical graduates are more vulnerable. In Australia, in that it doesn't show up in the training survey. It shows up that international medical graduates and Australian medical graduates have a similar prevalence. But it's the classic, we don't know what they think racism, sexual harassment is. Is it that Australian trained doctors call it out more on the survey than international medical graduates do? Does everyone have the same understanding? I'm not sure. And the way the question is phrased, it doesn't define any of those terms. So
Seems
I
like.
guess we don't really know. Yeah.
Notice Marjorie's got her hand up again. Do you still need the screen share? I'm just wondering if you
Oh
don't
no, I'll
put
just
your
stop
face
that.
up a little
Sorry.
bit. It's just nicer to have the
Yeah,
larger
sure. Absolutely.
picture. Yeah, thank you.
This intersectionalism with the international medical graduates, which really is confounding me at the moment, is a culture of silence, which the medical profession has, full stop.
Yep.
But a culture of silence that's even more important in many cultures. And thirdly, our international medical graduates are often very vulnerable based on their visas. And that's going to continue in a much bigger way with this next influx of international medical graduates, because they are going to be very dependent on the practices.
Yes, I agree. And you know, when I've talked to our Iranian author, you know, I found that really challenging. So she's done quite a lot of work in this space for her master's degree, and she's written from Iran. In Iran, I can't even read some of the articles because they're behind the king's paywall. So, there are things, would she expect that this survey is de-identified? I don't think she would. I don't think she would make that assumption, you know. So I don't know that they would tell us, even on what we would think was an anonymous survey, but you'd be pretty brave.
True.
Can I ask another question? It seems
Sure.
to me, and I've had the privilege of reading your book too, so that the if there's any answers to come, in my lifetime. It's going to be in training. It's going to be in education. And it seems that we've got insufficient training in this dreadful word, professionalism. Who defines that? But also insufficient information on training in reporting and insufficient training on things as simple as consent and professional boundaries.
Yep. Look, I wrote the medical education chapter. I wasn't supposed to, but our Polish authors weren't able to finish.
It's a good chapter.
Thank you. And I guess what I came across with that is I've been uncomfortable for a long time about looking at professionalism as a series of competencies. We've gone into atomizing medicine, that there are little bits of medicine, and if we know all the little bits, then we'll all be really good doctors. And that's never worked for professionalism. There comes a point, we all know. Sure, we know people who are screamingly incompetent. They're easy. When you've got your registrar who just has no idea and is performing very badly, it's a fairly easy one. The hard ones are the privileged ones who can roll it out in the exams, who do extremely well in the exams, but are underhanded and, are more of a risk, to be honest. And somewhere along the line, we lost the capacity, I think, to give global assessments. This person should not be a doctor, and we also lost reflection time. We lost the time to sit with our registrars and say, tell us something that made you feel a bit uncomfortable this week. For me, it's syringing ears. It took me a while to get used to syringing ears. I don't know why earwax was a problem. Vomit was fine. Poo was fine. Earwax I never liked. Everything. Medicine always has things that make you uncomfortable. And we need to normalize that in training, I think, with some time for reflection. We've filled it up with competencies. We need to be able to say, has anyone fainted in theatre yet? Someone always does. It's not your fault, you get used to it. It's okay. Because if we don't have those conversations, we'll never get to, I was standing next to Mr. Jones and he touched my bum and it felt really uncomfortable and I don't know whether he meant it or not and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. We can't have that conversation if we don't normalise other conversations of vulnerability. I actually think GP supervisors are good at this. I haven't spent as much time with non-GP specialists in recent years, but we need to give them time to think, because going back to your point on consent, Marjorie, it's not straightforward. I mean, look, if we did some of the things we do in medicine on the street, we'd be arrested. And honestly, you can say all you like things like, oh, intent doesn't matter. But I mean, if someone hits me when they're coming out of an anaesthetic because they're delusional, I don't accuse them of assault because I assume that they are not themselves, they're not competent. And that's what happens in ED, is that the young doctors don't know whether this is an aggressive thing or it's because they're sick or stressed, or they can't work it out because it's hard, isn't it? It's hard in geriatrics, it's hard in mental health, it's hard. And we have to start claiming back that space somehow from the outcome zealots who would like to reduce medicine to its little Lego pieces, and start looking at some of the more holistic things. And if there's one thing I learned in running GP training, supervisors may or may not be great at rating individual things, but my goodness, they're good at global ratings. They can tell you he's above average, he's average, or I'm really worried about this person, or this person should not graduate. And they're usually spot on, but we just don't listen to them because it's not seen as objective evidence anymore. And I think we've lost something in that.
Yeah, that's one of the things I struggle as a GP supervisor is, that objective ticking boxes and making sure, and you lose the global stuff. Something, a little extension of what you just said about, vulnerabilities and a touch or something can be much more for someone who has experienced issues in the past, who's got that backstory, than someone who it's never happened to. And so you can't give advice just based on exactly what happened, because it's part of a whole story and a whole picture.
Yeah, at ANU, I was running the professionalism curriculum, and we did one scenario that I thought was really telling. We just made it up, but I made up a big bluff male urologist who's got a loud voice and jokes with everyone, and has off humor and all the rest of it. And a young new international female graduate who's training in surgery who's never done urology before. And she starts missing days, lots and lots of days, starts not showing up. And she finds his behavior intensely intimidating and really difficult. And the students will go straight to, oh, well, you need to have a good, hard talk to him because he's being everything. But, you get them talking about, well, how do you make men comfortable down the pub? Well, you joke with them and you make this and you make that. And what you've got's a cross-cultural expectation, and maybe he's a horrible man, and maybe he's really inappropriate, but maybe this works in urology. And get them talking about how she might talk to the nurses on the ward, or have conversations with other people that feel uncomfortable with that, and why he behaves the way he behaves. Because in Australia, certainly in some of the communities I've worked in, that's the way, you swear, you joke, you make fun of things down the pub with your mates, and that's how you cope with prostate exams or whatever it is you have to do. So, it's not easy. And I think we have headed far too far down this competency framework. And also, I think zero tolerance doesn't make sense, because the edges are hard and they need to be talked through.
Yeah.
So
zero tolerance implies that there's a black and white thing, and there's a point at which it's one way or the other. And in fact,
right.
It's not.
No, it isn't. It really isn't. And I think we need to work at the edges. I always find with students, you start in first year and they get, I was lucky. I had informed consent. I knew how to do informed consent, but they get shared decision making. And you see the whites of their eyes when I say to them, how do you know that you've done shared decision making? Who makes the decision that you've done it? And they realize it's the patient. And they go, but they might have want something different. And you're like, yes, they might. And it's like, but how can you do that? Because, it's really hard. And I think we're doing them a disservice if we don't say it's hard, that sometimes you'll get it wrong. And we all know what it's like. You'll get one woman coming in with menopausal symptoms who say you pushed drugs, and another one saying that you didn't offer drugs and you weren't being woman-centered in either. There's a lot of unwinnables where you don't necessarily get it right, or you don't necessarily meet what someone needs. And it's an art, isn't it? It's a real art. And I think professionalism is too. You and we all know that there comes a time, and students get me with this one too, when I talk about parentalist behavior, and oh, that's bad. And I go, listen, if you catch me and I've been hit by a car and all my bones are broken, please don't wake me up and ask me to partner in the decision around the anaesthetic. Just do what you have to do. They find it very difficult to not default to one position. And we have to keep challenging that, because professionalism is the extreme end of that, where we have to have very, I think, nuanced approaches. I think the way I practice in Canberra, the way I practice in Broken Hill were very different. And they were both professional, but they were very different.
They needed to be, yeah. So it's just been fabulous talking around consent and behaviour and black and white and nuances. What would you like? Where do you see this book going as far as influencing the future?
I think one of the things we tried to do with the book is to say context matters. We've in that second section where we've got people from different expert positions, and then in the third section we've got people coming from different countries. And I have a problem with evidence-based whatever when it just assumes that it's some rigid fixed position. It's not. It's an interaction between the evidence, well, evidence-based medicine's the triad, isn't it? It's the doctor's opinion, plus the science, plus the patient's preference. And I think this is the same. It's the person's decision making, it's the behaviour and attitude of the perpetrator, and it's the system in which they work that makes a decision of what we do next. And I hope that by exposing that complexity, we'll get somewhere. But really, the chapter I feel most strongly about, apart from medical education, is always really important. But we talk about primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary prevention. Everyone wants to do primary prevention, zero tolerance. Let's get rid of it. But we need to get better, and the medical educators will help us here. Get better at teaching, learning, assessing competencies. That is important. The secondary stuff, we've got a lot of work to do, because I don't think that the way that we manage this with international medical graduates, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and other First Nations graduates, anyone with degrees of intersectional disprivilege, including the LGBTIQA plus community and the male survivors who have a lot of trouble sort of fitting into the narratives that they hear. So I think there's a secondary prevention bit about, well, what do we do with the people at higher risk? And what do we do at the places of higher risk? Do we need different strategies in mental health? Do we need different strategies in rural, where they're going to be living on their own? Do we need different strategies in aged care, where we're finding that, behaviour is disinhibited? Tertiary, we've got to stop, demonising the victims. I mean, what happened to that surgeon is appalling. The process caused harm. And the other thing we don't have is we don't have rehab. So one of the participants in my study, after 7 years, went back to work, and she said, I felt like hugging the walls because the floor didn't feel safe. But she didn't have any rehab. She didn't have a reintroduction to the workplace or anything like that.
She would surely have had some degree of counselling and psychotherapy, which would have helped, given her hopefully some coping skills and understanding.
Yes, absolutely. But she could have walked in day one, given her discipline, to a rape victim.
Yeah, so
that's the trouble with
medicine. No return to work program.
That's right. That's the bit that's missing. It's not the recovery bit. The recovery bit's fine. It's how does she? It's a bit like, medicine is like a family. It's like a culture, and it's like, dad's alcoholism or mum's gambling. She has to re-enter a flawed family and become part of that family again that's harmed her. And what we would normally do in that circumstance is we would have safe people around that are part of the family too. And I haven't thought through enough of that, but I've had a long conversation with Helen Milroy, who, those of you who don't know, is Australia's first Aboriginal child and adolescent psychiatrist, to talk about healing community, like how as a community we can wrap around someone like that and actually bring them back into the family of healthcare safely without, and support them however they want to be supported. But what we don't want to do is have a low-level HR person who, it really bothers me that one of the editors calls it making them have a cup of coffee with Brian. Let's just go out and have a cup of coffee and we'll sort this out. It's not at that level. We need someone senior to debrief. And I guess it comes back to the reflection, doesn't it? We also have to have some much better, and New Zealand does this well, much better guidelines about who gets to know stuff and who gets to say stuff. New Zealand has policies that say things like, if you are this person, this is what you will know and this is what you will not. Whereas we have it a lot looser, and there's too much gossip and all that sort of thing. And then we get people going to the media and saying things like Caroline Tan wore a low-cut top, which was nonsense. Who gets to do that? That's just not on.
Do you think the media actually makes it harder then?
Yeah, of course they do. Yes. I mean, I often say, I think the last positive story I've seen about a doctor is the Thai cave rescue. I think it's been quite a while. And they do descend on bad medicine very fast. And that's awful because they will go into, unfortunately, a very polarized position of. But it's interesting the way they shape it. You know, John Kearsley, when he lost his professorship, I was fascinated by the writing of it because they managed to get the subject out of the sentence. So the phrase was from the University of New South Wales that he'd been stripped of his professorship because his behaviour was inconsistent with the code. So it wasn't because John Kearsley has been committed of sexual assault. It wasn't that he is now in jail. It was objectified as far as it could go. And the women don't get that. The Caroline Tan thing from Miranda Devine is a classic. If you have just hope that, what did you say? If you have a problem and you need a senior neurosurgeon and you can't get one, blame Caroline Tan, who has ruined the senior surgeons. Just pray you don't get a brain tumour.
Well, that's certainly, taking the victim to task.
And he had been convicted in a civil court, but he'd been convicted. So,
and yet she was responsible for.
Of course.
Gosh.
So I think the two steps forward, going back to your original thing, I think we need to think very carefully about that trajectory where we're looking at primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary, which is the damage of the process, which often is exposure, so in the media or whatever. And the other thing we need to think about is what goes before we need clever psychiatrists who, in my view, haven't recently been respected for their depth. I so appreciate psychiatry for the way that it thinks as a discipline, and I would really love to have those guys think more deeply about how we can move doctors from shame and silence to speaking. There's this whole field in there that just has to be subconscious, and there's all sorts of stuff going on, and we need those psychiatrists who have that understanding to help us unpack that. And I guess the third thing I would say is we need to make sure the policies mesh together. The medical board in Australia told me that it's fixed, that they've got a policy now, so it's all fixed. I thought that was probably a slight overreach, but the trouble is, you'll get policies that intersect and overlap and that they contradict and they even contradict themselves. So I'm hoping that AI will help us a little with that mapping policy. So it's a little bit less like a soup, and more like a flow chart with any luck.
So certainly not fixed, as in not fixed and set in stone, because we're really wanting things to change. I'm just very conscious of the time. We've been chatting for an hour, and I think we should do it for as long again. Really fascinating stuff, and I'm sorry that we're not going to come out with solutions and this is the way it should be done, because it's a big cultural change. What would you like to, I'm going to give you one last word. What would you like to say? Or maybe we should just welcome Melissa and see if she had any burning questions before we sign off.
Well, I suppose, I'll put in my little pitch at the end. We're trying really hard to raise sufficient money to, and I've been so grateful to the people who've already done that. We've tried to raise money to try and make the book open access, which will not surprise you. I need to have a good imprint, which is Cambridge University Press, because that'll get the senior doctors reading it. If I self-publish, no one's going to read it at that level. But I also need it open access so that the students in Zambia can actually have their hands on it. But it is around the $25,000 to $30,000 mark. So it's been a bit of a crowdfunding nightmare. So I'll send you the link, and please feel free if anyone's got a cup of coffee or a rich maiden aunt to.
I know we've put it out to our readership and the e-bulletin, but maybe we can do another one on the strength of when we're publicising this particular interview. We can say donations still welcome. Melissa, did you have any last question before we sign off?
I like your thought about how we need to look at how victims can be return to their careers. It's a big problem in the lack of support for victims across a broad range of areas, I guess.
Yep.
It's also like there is also a broader issue of people who have been out of the medical workforce for a variety of reasons, right? That I mean, we have a problem with lack of medical workforce in this country. And you've mentioned reasons why people might be leaving. And of course, we don't want to ignore that, but also the barriers to re-entry. And one of the things we saw was after COVID, a lot of doctors decided not to come back. So, and of course, nurses as well. So, yeah, it is quite rightly the medical board, or APRA as they call themselves now, want to maintain standards and all that sort of thing. But yeah, what are we doing? It reminds me of that appalling case in the UK where there was a female registrar who was from, I think, an Asian country.
That was mentioned earlier by before you joined, but
oh right, yes.
I'll let you check back. Yeah, it was pretty awful. Yeah.
But the point was that apart from all the other awful things about that, she had just returned from maternity leave and was dumped straight back into a very full-on situation.
Yes.
And that's
what
really
I would like to see. Yeah, it was. So what I would like to see is what would, and I'll phrase this as a question, what would it look like? So when I have to define professionalism, I'll use the physician's definition, which is professionalism is about establishing and maintaining trust. It's about being trustworthy. And I often think about it and think, what would it be like if we held the institutions to the same requirements as the individuals? So what would it look like if we held the managers who were responsible for making the doctors apologise for reporting Lucy Letby? What would it look like if we were to hold them as responsible as the individuals? And I think there is a lot of complicit behaviour that occurs where individuals bear the brunt of structural decisions. And I don't think it's that simple. You can't be an excellent doctor if you don't have the tools to be excellent. And that's where we're at with the re-entry question. But I suppose I would also say, for me, there's a natural trajectory, isn't there? You walk in day one of the medical school, you want to change the world, you want everything to be wonderful. And I've got one of the chapters I've used a student, a resident, a registrar, and me looking at what they want. And of course, the student is strident about how awful this all is and it ought to be fixed because it's all wrong and terrible, and because we feel strongly as students, and good for them, we need them in the team. And over time, it's like growing up as adolescents. Adolescents, when they start with their personal identities, they start off very strident and they become much more layered. I think doctors with their professional identities are the same. They start with very black and white views of what's right and what's wrong and the way we should be and the way we shouldn't be. And gradually they mature into a much more layered space. What happens with sexual harassment is there is a break and they lose their respect for the profession in one fell swoop. And coming back from that is really hard. In the same way that it's hard if you rip away a kid's childhood, if you make them homeless at 15 and make them on the streets having to manage by themselves. So this is where I think psychiatry matters. I really do. I think I want to see a lot more. And I think of all the disciplines, even mine, which I obviously bemoan now and then about the way general practice is at this point in history, but I think disregarding the enormous strengths of psychiatry has been a real loss, because I think they would have a lot to say and a lot to contribute.
Well, we're going to have to start asking them. So thank you for drawing that I think we really do need to draw at least
Sorry,
the recording to an end, because I'm very conscious that we've been running for over an hour now. Thank you very much, Marjorie, for attending. And I might actually stop the recording. I'll say good night to everyone, and we can just have a bit of a chat to say our final farewells. But thank you very much, Louise. I do wish you all the best with the book, and I do hope that we'll get a few more donations as a result of this little
we'll
exercise.
make it work.
All right, thank you very
Right,
much.
everyone.